gang, welcome back. Here we are at the onset of module number 2 for this term. So we've gotten through module 1, congratulations, and module 1 also served kind of as a drop add period. So we have some new faces with us and some people who have perhaps moved on to other activities. So this will be sort of our final selection for the rest of the way. For those of you who are new, welcome, and we wish those who have moved on the best, sending good vibes to them. So in module 1, we handle sort of some of the introductory level stuff, right? We talked about systemic thinking and just sort of an introduction to the rationale for family therapy, whether you're working conjointly with multiple family members or whether or not you're working with an individual. Because since we are sort of social creatures by nature, whether we're an individual or coming to therapy as a family or a couple, we bring our family history, the lessons, the habits, the worldview, the perspective that has developed from early childhood, starting with pre-verbal existence. We bring that with us to the consulting room as clients and, as it turns out, as clinicians. So in this module, and boy, I apologize in advance for the just myriad resources that I have included in this module. We'll talk a little bit about how to prioritize things and which things can drop off the plate for perhaps review later. This module really is kind of like opening up a fire hydrant and trying to drink from it. So we will get into, in chapter 3 from the text, we'll talk about, and you'll read about, sort of developing understandings of human diversity as it relates to family counseling, family therapy. And we will talk about sort of the history and emergence of family therapy as a well-accepted, legitimized form of psychotherapy as it emerged in the middle part of the 20th century into the current times. And so I've included, in addition to your text, which is really the only required piece of reading for this module and this course, I've included, well, you also will need to watch this video. I've included some other articles by, well, one is by me and a research team about the experiences of families that have a transgender member. That's one of the things that your text does not really cover in depth. When it talks about, or when you read about gender-related issues in the text, they're really talking about the division of labor between men and women. And that's another important topic from which we can learn a lot from our gender expansive and gay, lesbian, bisexual, intersex neighbors and siblings. And to that end, I have included, not in this module, but as an extra credit opportunity for later in the term, in addition to the sort of activity about sort of planning for therapy or doing sort of an analysis of the movie Silver Linings Playbook, I've included a newer documentary called Fair Play, which is based on a book by Eve Rodsky who's not a therapist. She's actually an attorney, but she is an advocate for equitable division of labor, sharing of resources in families. And there's an activity for you to watch this documentary, which I've included at no cost, which maybe is an advantage over Silver Linings Playbook activity, where you will have to find the video and rent it in some way, shape, or form. Fair Play, I have purchased it myself, and I have shared it with you for your viewing pleasure. It really gets at, even though there is a strong movement for improved equity and the division of labor and sharing of resources in families currently, when it comes to the perceptions of especially men who think that they are doing sort of equal work with their female partners, they really are doing about a third of the work, while their female partners who are probably working in the workforce outside the home, the women are still doing at least 2/3 of the household labor. And so we still have lots of work to do. Fair Play is an attempt to draw attention to this issue, and also to offer a reasonable and guided solution. So I invite you to take a look at that as it relates to sort of equity and division of labor and sharing of resources between men and women and families. Key part of that documentary is that it does interviews with same-sex couples and presents some things that can be learned from and applied to opposite-sex couples who are still trying to emerge from the myth of the nuclear family, where husband goes to work, wife stays home, takes care of the kids. That's never really existed, even though we've been in our society made to believe that that is the ideal. All that to say, I think you'll find it very thought-provoking. In addition to, if you find that the documentary is really interesting, I would also encourage you to read the book, which gets into more of these solution to the gender equity concerns. So, back to what we were talking about. So your text does not really do a great job of talking about sort of the wider breadth of appreciation of gender and affectional diversity as we understand it currently in families. I've included some reading about that as it relates to transgender youth in families in the United States. I've also included a longer but sort of free use, open access book called Making Black Lives Matter by Kevin Coakley. Dr. Coakley is a clinical psychologist focusing on sort of black psychology. He is a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin, and is just a leader in the field for challenging and examining current practices and their sort of roots in sort of colonialism and white supremacist sort of systems that are baked into our society. So I encourage you to read that. It may not necessarily have a direct relationship with family therapy, but it does provide a wide range of sort of perspective from Black authors about what it means to be black in our society. And these are things that I think will be valuable for all of us to know about and to have a deep awareness of as we work with a wider range of clients who come from a wider range of backgrounds. We talk a lot about serving Appalachia in this program, and I think one of the risks of doing that is that in our society, Appalachia has been sort of associated with white people in poverty, right? And that's not fair. We, of course, include black families who have descended from families who were brought to this country as slaves. When we think about just poor white families, we exclude especially Latino families that perhaps are living in Appalachian regions to participate in agrarian farm-based work. In my area of the country of Virginia, we have multiple sort of poultry processing plants that have a majority of Hispanic, Chicano, and otherwise Latinx sort of members of the workforce. And so we need to have a deep understanding of the experiences of a wider range of people. And so I'm including these resources for you to at least turn the crank for you on that. Now, more specifically to family counseling, I've also included videos of a couple of sort of giants in the field sharing their work and doing the work with actual clients. So the first that I will share with you will show up in the item for chapter 3. There will be 2 videos, each about an hour long. Keep in mind that these are not required, but I encourage you to watch them. And my hope is that you can do this viewing while you're doing something else, right? Like maybe eating breakfast or, folding laundry, whatever the case may be. And in these videos, so Harry Aponte is the giant in the field I'm talking about. Aponte is a Hispanic man who grew up in Black Harlem in the, I believe he's in his late 70s now, so he was born in the 40s. So he's growing up in the middle part of the 20th century. And he has been a family therapist for the majority of his life. He is closely associated with the structural family therapy framework. He was one of the directors of the Philadelphia Child Guidance Clinic under the mentorship of Salvador Minuchin. Interestingly, and perhaps a little bit ironically, one of my trainers, Steve Greenstein, was also one of these directors. In fact, Steve was the first sort of director of clinical psychology. I'm kind of fumbling that title. But he was one of the first directors of, or chief psychologists at Child Guidance under Minuchin. And if I'm not mistaken, Harry Aponte was actually chosen over Steve to lead Child Guidance as Dr. Minuchin was phasing out. And then Steve went into private practice and eventually started an agency in Virginia that I became a part of in the late, 2009. So all that to say, the field also is not immune from what could be considered systemic or family dysfunction. All that to say, again, here I am using the same cliche phrase over and over again. What I'm trying to say is, Dr. Aponte, I think, does a lovely job of demonstrating work with a black family, and then also illuminating the primary role of the person of the therapist. One of the things that you will especially read in chapter 5 about sort of the history and emergence of family therapy is that it, of course, like most, really, I think all forms of psychotherapy in the West, emerged from Freudian psychoanalysis. The original sort of emphasis upon the therapist in psychoanalysis was to minimize participation, while at the same time acknowledging that the really most powerful therapeutic energy was sort of centered around the dynamics or the interplay of transference from client to therapist and countertransference from therapist to client. Now, just to sort of bring this phenomenon of transference, countertransference into our course, remembering from last module, the attachment behavioral system, right? Essentially, transference, for our purposes, is the enactment or acting out of a client's attachment patterns upon the therapist, right? And countertransference is the therapist acting out their attachment patterns upon the client, right? And so while original psychoanalysis attempted to minimize the participation of the therapist, more current iterations of family therapy, really coming from a constructivist, postmodern viewpoint, acknowledge and encourage the participation of the therapist in the family system, right? So we as therapists, when we're truly skillful, allow ourselves to be participants in the room with our clients and collaborate with our clients to see the patterns that are maintaining their suffering. By patterns, I mean sort of their attachment patterns, their relationship patterns toward themselves and others that are rooted in their attachment sort of development and experiences. Help them see these patterns, name them in a way that is non-judgmental, sort of normalizes and sort of illuminates how they are interfering with the client's well-being, and then collaborates towards strategizing and practicing ways to change these patterns and develop new habits, that relationship habits towards self and other, that are more likely to minimize suffering and, or at least make good use of suffering and promote well-being in the client's context. So Aponte has written a book called The Person of the Therapist, and in addition to the video that shows him working in a first session with a family, there's a video about him sort of discussing his person of the therapist model. That is a video from YouTube from an interview he did with the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy in 2020. Of course, the video, it'll be obvious. Aponte looks like a man in his 70s in the 2020 video, and he looks like a man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s. In the a video with him working with a family that was probably recorded in the 90s or early 2000s. So that's sort of what I want you to focus on in terms of understanding and beginning to develop your own use of yourself as a primary means of intervention with families. That leads us to why we do these genograms, right? And I've included in the chapter 5 item, I've included a video of Monica McGoldrick, who literally wrote and several editions and several sort of adjunctive versions of the book on genograms, right? So you're going to see Dr. McGoldrick do an interview with, Yalom is his last name, but it's the son of Urban Yalom, I believe. I'll like to say it's not Urban Yalom. Another name that you may recognize, and if you don't recognize it, I encourage you to Google who Urban Yalom is and to get to know his contributions to the field. So you'll see an interview with Monica McGoldrick, and then you will see her doing sort of a reenactment of a first session in which she does a genogram with a client. And then you will see a sort of a debrief interview about this session with Yalom as the video concludes. This video is about 2 hours long. So again, incorporate it into your time wisely. I think the value of it is going to be, there's going to be a couple important takeaways. Number one, you're going to witness the master doing the thing that she's the master of, right? And you'll get, I think, a little bit more insight into why we as family counseling instructors, why the field sort of does this teaching intervention this way. Like, we want you as a student to dive into your own genogram. That has sort of a twofold purpose, right? One is to teach you how to do the technique, right? Which is geared toward helping illuminate, essentially, so see it, name it, change it. See the pattern that's causing or maintaining suffering, name it in a way that invites change, and then strategize and practice new ways of doing the thing that, changing the pattern to promote well-being. That's sort of the main flow of all therapy, but especially family therapy. And in addition to that, part of that process is part of the see it process and name it process is to make the implicit, sort of the things that the habit action that is sort of coming from the right side of the brain, that is happening almost, pretty much sort of outside of a person's consciousness, making that implicit sort of activity explicit, making it seeable so that a person can work with it and do something about it, integrating these two hemispheres of the brain. So that's one of the primary things that this genogram tool does, is it helps you as a therapist and the client make what is implicit explicit. And I think you'll see in the video with Dr. McGoldrick, you'll see John, her client, having sort of light bulbs go off. And that's the process of witnessing or experiencing the implicit becoming explicit, and now the client has sort of new ground to stand on, new and fresh perspective on how to work with their own sort of attachment and relationship patterns to themselves and to others. As Dr. McGoldrick will at least allude to, okay, the skillful clinician is self-aware enough and secure/autonomous enough to be able to recognize, name, and then and then use the countertransference present in the room in constructive ways in the service of the client's therapeutic goals, right? Let me say that again. So the skillful clinician is self-aware enough and secure, autonomous enough to recognize, name, and then use countertransference constructively in the here and now in the service of their client's therapeutic goals, right? And the genogram that we're asking you to do is a primary means of helping you achieve this self-awareness and hopefully improve your own intrapersonal and interpersonal security and autonomy so that you can be on your way to developing into the most skillful clinician you can be, right? Now, of course, on the surface, this assignment is asking you to be familiar with the people in your family and the relational dynamics and patterns across at least 3 generations, okay? What I'm also asking you to do is to be looking for and reflecting upon the ways in which your family transmuted, and what I mean by that is that sort of baked into your psyche and your perspective assumptions about human beings that may be rooted in oppressive thinking, right? These are some of the things that can produce blind spots in each of us, right? Sort of a twist on countertransference that we can, even those of us who have the best of intentions, that we can then end up relating to people who may be different from us, and undermining our goal to constructively use countertransference in the service of our clients' therapeutic goals, essentially minimizing their suffering and promoting their well-being. We run the risk, because we are, by the nature of our position, in a position of power with our clients, we run the risk of perpetuating harm if we are not able to see, name, and then constructively use our own blind spots in the here and now. So let me share with you from my own genogram a little bit about what I mean by that. So as you can see here, this on the left side of the board is sort of a description of my family across 1, 2, 3, and then technically 4 generations, okay? And then on the right side is my wife's family, okay? And you'll see that my name is here. I married my wife, Nikki, in 2007. We have 2 children. What we haven't talked about with you yet is that we also had a miscarriage that we were led to believe based on early ultrasounds, were probably twins that were sort of a spontaneous abortion. They did not develop really past just a few weeks of gestation. That occurred in 2013, okay? And this line here indicates that we know about this and we talk about it from time to time, but of course, for reasons that probably seem obvious, we have not talked about it with with Emily and Alice to this point. At some point, I imagine we might, right? Because one of the ways we can use this suffering that we went through constructively is that now, and Nikki, by the way, is also a therapist. Now we have an experience that we can sort of use as a frame of reference when we're working with clients that go through something similar, right? And because we went through this, we now know that this experience of miscarriage is far more common than certainly we realized when it happened to us. And so now we have a way of helping to normalize that and to support clients who are grieving when that happens. Right? Moving into the next generation, right? Early on in my life, and I'm the firstborn of my side of the family, firstborn of my parents. Secondborn is Ben. Thirdborn is John. Okay. Early on, as the firstborn, I would say that my mother and I had what could be considered an enmeshed relationship, right? Well, let me put it this way. So, as I have grown older, and there's I failed to mention this, there is another video that is much shorter, about 10 minutes long, about genograms and kind of talking briefly about Murray Bowen's contribution to family therapy. You'll read about Dr. Bowen in your text as well. He is sort of a person credited with sort of inventing the genogram as an assessment tool, right? And his theory of sort of family therapy and the way in which people develop in a healthy way, sort of trying to eliminate the need for differentiation between child and parent. And early on, I would say that we were, my mother and I were enmeshed, which had an effect on my parents' relationship and it had an effect on my relationship and my brother's relationship with both me and my mother. I would say that my own therapeutic work has been focused on finding ways to differentiate from my mother. One of the benefits of this differentiation has been now, as I'm sort of a member of at the time of this recording, I'm a member of what some people would call the sandwich generation, right? I have children, young children, I'm middle-aged, and I have aging parents, right? And my parents are in the process of selling their home in Georgia and buying a home near me and my family here in Virginia. They came this weekend for a visit to look at houses. And one house that my mom really wanted, she really got attached to it. They essentially sort of lost the bidding war on it, right? They didn't get the house. And she was really kind of heartbroken about it. And as someone who's gone through the home buying process, it's easy to get attached to a house. And I understand that. Now, one of the things that I think was notable was that the night that they lost the house, my mother was very sad, sitting on the couch in one of the rooms of my house. And it was around bedtime for the children, and we were in the process of getting them, my wife and I were in the process of getting them upstairs, and my mom asked me to send my oldest down to her. When I asked her why, because it was a bit of an inconvenient time for a visit since we were trying to get them to sleep, my mom said that she wanted to just love on her a little bit. Now, on the surface, and I hope you hear this in the spirit that it's meant, I'm not trying to judge or criticize my mother, but on the surface, that seems innocuous, right? Seems lovely, kind. But knowing what I know about my relationship with my mother, I could recognize that there was a very good chance that my mother's request was rooted in an attempt to perhaps use sort of snuggling with my 6-year-old daughter as a way of soothing her own distress, right? Now, I recognize from my understanding of human development that that puts the child in a bit of a role reversal with the older adult, right? It is the job of the older adult to soothe the younger human, not, as I've said in previous videos, not the little person's job to soothe the older one. So, perhaps awkwardly, I found a reason to say, we're not going to do that right now. And I think that was sort of something that happened between my mom and me at a very early age, and only because of my own work, both through my genogram and my own therapy, was I able to recognize this in real time and do something different, sort of create a positive feedback loop, right? So that my family has a chance to make appropriate developmental adjustments, right? Now, this enmeshment, right, also, I think, played a role in conflict that I have with my middle brother, okay? So, my middle brother is the second born. He was born, I was almost 4 when he was born, so I had almost 4 years of this, and Ben is born and threatens my connection here, right? Which I had, of course, as a young person, become accustomed to. Threatens this because the older person has the new job and of taking care of the vulnerable infant. And so mother's attention is divided, right? Understandably so. Now, I'm not sure, well, I certainly know that I did not handle that well, and I have questions now about my parents' approach to preparing me for how that went. Whatever the case, what ended up resulting was I was very hard and kind of bullied Ben when we were very young, right? Up until about adolescence, when I had some experiences that kind of illuminated how my behavior was violating my own values and causing my brother harm. But it was, at that time, almost 9 years of that pattern with Ben. And even though we are 3 decades later, we still have difficulty maintaining a mutually supportive relationship. Now, here's where the triangles form, right? So, during this time, Mom having me as a first experience had a very hard time adjusting to Ben being different, right? And as you may not be surprised to learn, Ben tried to develop his own identity and attract parental attention by acting in ways that were unignorable, right? They were breaking rules and unignorable. But this was all after Ben learned that he was not really being protected from my bullying, right? And so my mother essentially, from my own analysis, lost credibility with my brother, and my brother is essentially, for the duration of his life, in some way, shape, or form, kind of giving my mom the finger, okay? And that being said, he also never really developed skills necessary for being fully differentiated and a secure, autonomous adult. So he still struggles with employment. He struggles with relationships and stable relationships. And so this conflict remains, and as you may be able to see here, I know this is very jumbled, there's a dotted line here, and likely has led to a de facto cutoff, right? In fact, Ben, for a while, a few years ago, had moved out to Seattle. He moved back recently, and now has things have kind of sort of repeated, the pattern has repeated itself, and he has moved back to Seattle, where he has an ex-wife and a 6-year-old son. Now, that's one example of how my own genogram and my own work has allowed me to see and work with and be aware of how this type of triangle can develop in a family. And one of my vulnerabilities, because of this experience, is that when I'm working with a family, I run the risk of over-identifying or over-connecting with mothers to the point that I may have difficulty with helping mothers to be reflective on how their own attachment patterns are inhibiting their goal or undermining their goal to help their children grow up to be secure, autonomous adults. Another element of this, and keep in mind, at middle age here in the, I suppose, almost the first quarter of the 20th century, 21st century, excuse me, I'm only one generation removed from the Jim Crow era of the United States history. So, some of you may have read or seen the movie The Help, okay? My mother's family had a black maid, several black maids over time when my mother was growing up, right? And so she had her own sort of thinking about sort of the differences between the races. And so I remember early experiences when I or my brothers would come home from elementary school, and we would share stories, as elementary school children do, about what happened that day, and kids getting into conflict or kids getting into trouble, whatever the case may be. And typically, when we would have these conversations with my mother, the first question out of her mouth would be, was this child white or black, right? And so that sort of embedded in my own psyche the difference and sort of elevated to primacy differences between skin color, right? Because the implication there was that if the child was black, there was something inferior about the child, right? And I had to do my own work to disentangle my mind from that sort of wiring, that thinking pattern, right? Now, one of the ways that shows up in my family is that Ben married a black woman and has had a long history of dating black women. Shayna, who I kind of miss, honestly, and really appreciate, was a truth teller in my family, right? I have very vivid memories of her naming and bringing to the surface racism baked into my own family. And I think I think it's in conversations that I have had with my brother, it had at least a role in their divorce. But perhaps as a means of cosmic justice, the first grandchild in my family is Benny. He was born about 3 months ahead of my daughter Emily. Benny is mixed race and will be considered a black man, right? Because in our society, if there's any color, as you're probably aware, at least currently, they are considered to be black. Benny also deals with or is affected by autism, and that puts another level of strain on the family. So these are all things that I'm just putting out there as sort of cursory examples of how this process is likely to illuminate not just sort of the cybernetic aspects of your family that have led to your sort of current condition psychologically, that will likely show up as countertransference in session, but also the ways in which your family's perspective on human diversity are likely to affect you, and the work that you will likely need to do in order to meet your potential as a clinician. There are lots of other things that have happened in my family that we don't really have time to get into, but you may or may not be able to see this, but we have 2 suicides in my family, right? One of the suicides, or one of the people who died by suicide, my Uncle Swain, you may have seen, and you will see, a portrait of my Uncle Swain, which I have in my office behind my desk. Uncle Swain was gay, and was sort of a poorly kept family secret. He died in 1965. I never got to meet him. My dad was 12 years old. He was living in Atlanta, which these days fancies itself a very progressive city and gay affirming, but it certainly wasn't that way in 1965. That, in a lot of ways, has been something that has motivated a lot of my work. We have another suicide here, my mother's older brother, and that is a bit of a mystery, right? By the time that he died, there was a bit of a cutoff. I don't know if you can see that here, but there is a dotted line indicating a cutoff between my Uncle Jackie's family and my family. There was some kind of conflict between my mother and him that led to a cutoff between his children and my siblings that has only been exacerbated since his passing. There's also the element of substance abuse and physical abuse. I was cut off from my maternal grandfather in sort of another mysterious way, right? So the relationship and openness to Papa Jack differed among his grandchildren from his son Jackie and his son Andy. As I'm looking at it, maybe I think I neglected to put Andy up here. His son Andy has 4 children. Uncle Jackie had 3 children. They had at least semi-regular contact with him before he died in the late 90s. And I think I met him twice. I have very vague memories. One was when he was sick and had gone to the hospital for surgery, and one was at Andy's wedding. So there's a cutoff there. There are elements of substance abuse throughout. So my father's father, my grandfather Fred, died in what was probably a drunk driving crash in 1955. And My parents both abuse alcohol, and so my wife and I have to be very cognizant about sort of our own substance use, and which, as many of you may have experienced during the pandemic, became sort of exacerbated by the stress of the pandemic. So we've had to do some revisiting and reevaluation and changing of our habits when it comes to substance use. On my wife's side, there's substance abuse here too, interestingly enough. And this has also led to some just mystery in my family. My father-in-law's father, Jersey, was a mayor in a small Polish town during what became the Nazi occupation. In the midst of, leading up to it, in the midst of World War II. He was imprisoned as a government leader in multiple concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau, two of the most notorious concentration camps. My wife remembers witnessing before he died, he had the number tattoo. Perhaps, and this is where the mystery is, he married, or we actually don't know if they were actually married or not, but he became involved with Léonce, who was a brilliant academic who spoke, if I'm not mistaken, 9 different languages, but she was a Nazi sympathizer during the war, and escaped Germany on the last train out of Berlin. I'm not sure how they got together, but what I learned after I did my own genogram during my master's program was that Jersey had a family prior to his imprisonment that he never returned to. I only know that because one of his children reached out to my father-in-law's brother, Jan, trying to connect and try to put their own family story together. And my father-in-law refused to participate. He was worried that they were interested in not much more than financial motivations, which is a real shame, and it leads, especially my wife, to wonder about cousins that she has in Eastern Europe. So, I can probably talk another hour about my own genogram. I'm very interested to learn about what you discover in your genograms. And please begin to work, if you have not already, to familiarize yourself with the genogram process. There's, in this module, a series of readings that are about the process itself. I've also included some readings about how to minimize or avoid hetero and cis normativity when it comes to developing genograms. There are some symbols that are specific to gender expansiveness and affectional diversity, affectional orientation diversity. And I've included an article that explains a little bit about why that effort has come to be. There are documents also that kind of include this, but don't really give a good explanation for the effort behind it. The article I'm referencing that gives the explanation was published earlier this year. I look very much forward to connecting with you about these issues for yourself, not only in your genogram, but in the discussion boards. Once we get through this module, I think you'll find we will begin to kind of just get into different sort of modalities of taking the see it and name it process and different interventions or different ways in which we use ourselves and the energy within the between family members to change family patterns. We will get into the work of Virginia Satir, Salvador Minuchin, Carl Whitaker, and others in coming modules. We will discuss some of the ethical dilemmas and concerns that are specific to working with families. I look very much forward to how you become aware that this is shaping you as a future clinician, and how it's affecting some of you are doing some of your clinical work already, and how it's affecting your work in real time. Until then, have a great rest of your day, and look forward to connecting with you in other means of the course. Thanks, y'all.